not create. Yeah. Okay, Sananya, you are host now. Take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. First of all, I just wanted to introduce the Education Committee. I know that we haven't really talked about who is running these meetings. So the OSA youth group decided among themselves. We have 3 major committees to, get everyone active in the Black Lives Matter movement. So we are presenting all of these Sunday meetings on behalf of the Education Committee, run by myself, Rainey Patnaik, and Maya Acharya. She's been doing most of the meetings. I've kind of been behind the scenes so far. And our committee members include Bagmi Das, Mrinali Das, Bidan Mahanti, who also did a presentation last week. Basically, we want to educate everyone, our Odia community, all the uncles, aunties, the kids, the history behind Black America. We want to talk about, we want to get people talking about the uncomfortable topics. What is racism? How is it in our lives? What can we do? Look at, kind of introspect and look at our community. If we have problems, how can we address them? So we want to talk about more social justice in the long run, but this is pressing, so we want to start with Black Lives Matter. In previous weeks, we have, I don't know if everyone's been here last week, the week before when it started, but Maya kind of started talking about how it started with the George Floyd murder and how that led to the massive amount of protests we've been seeing, why people are protesting, the history, a quick history of Black Lives Matter and the civil rights movement. We've also talked about a brief history of policing, of slavery in the United States, and how that led to the police, the organization that we know of as modern police. We've also talked about what is going on right now, why there's so many protesting, what can we do. We've talked about how to talk with our immigrant families, how to talk to children about racism, finding neutral news sources, so and so. And today we have a presentation by the New Jersey youth group. So take it away, Aradhya.
Perfect. Hi, I'm Aradhya Rajanala, and I'm helping to lead the regional New Jersey movement in trying to raise awareness for Black Lives Matter and hopefully to create some political activism. So this is my sister, Ariana. Hi. And I'll just briefly introduce, we have also in the New Jersey, also leading New Jersey movement, Ellie and Emma Mohanty.
Hi.
And Arvind and Aman Mohapatra.
Hey everyone.
So these last couple of weeks, we've been talking a lot about what's happening and how we can all take part and join this movement to move towards equality. This week, we want to take a step back a little bit and just get a proper understanding of what the background of all of these movements are. We've all heard of the death of George Floyd and how this is causing problems and how everyone's moving against this. But we wanted to talk about how did this come up in the first place, and where do we stand in terms of racism? What is it, and how can we combat it even in our communities ourselves? And I think we think that foundation will help to bridge the gap so that we can understand what's going on more properly now and have the background we need to participate properly. Do I have the ability to screen share? Let me just make sure.
You should.
Okay, great. Great. Can everyone see the presentation?
Yep, you're good.
Yep.
If I hit present, will you still be able to?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'll hand it off to Ellie to start us off.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Again, I'm Ellie. I'm from the New Jersey chapter, and this is my sister, Emma. But I just want to start off with some guidelines and disclaimers for today's conversation. So just to reiterate, like, we are here to talk about this, and this is not a comfortable topic. It might be uncomfortable, but that's okay. And it's okay to also not be completely happy with our beliefs right now. We want to encourage that we're allowed to change our beliefs after we learn more information. And again, even all of us as youth, we are also in the same boat with you, learning and trying to change our own beliefs and thinking critically about what's going on. So the purpose of this is to extend that conversation with everybody else. And we also would like everyone to be comfortable asking questions and bringing up additional perspectives. Again, we're all here to learn together, but we're going to refrain from answering questions in the middle of the presentation. We're going to have a Google form, which I think Rainey will put into the chat box. So if you would like to ask a question, you can do so anonymously through that form, and then we'll try and answer them as many as we can at the end. And again, please try to take our words with your own perspective. Don't take them at full face value. We really want to encourage critical thinking and bringing up points that you may not even think are right, because I think it's important that all of us kind of look at everything that we're speaking about from multiple perspectives, just for that same goal of trying to understand better and change if we need to. So moving on to the introduction. So as we've kind of spoken about a little bit already, and we've already spoken about in past weeks, we all know at this point that on May 25th, George Floyd was killed by a police officer. And since then, and also around the same time, many other Black Americans have been killed by police as well. And in each case, the officer's actions have been denounced. Since May 26th, we've seen in the news and through conversation, many protests have been occurring demanding police accountability and racial equality, and this has spread fully nationwide as well as globally. And here on the right, you can see a figure that shows fatal police shootings that have been remarkably consistent every year. And if we look at 2020 at the bottom, you can see that it's on track to follow the same horrible track record. So when we're thinking about why this is happening and there's this push for racial equality, it's clear that racism exists, but where is racism coming from within each person? Like, what is it rooted in? And racism is really rooted in what we call bias. So bias is an inclination or predisposition for or against something, as defined by the APA Dictionary of Psychology. And it's essentially a cognitive shortcut, and it isn't necessarily good or bad. It's usually helpful because it's what we take from our world and our surroundings to help us figure out what's harmful or what's going to be safe. But it can hurt when we don't have all the information and then we create cognitive shortcuts without realizing that what we're doing can harm other people. And this can lead to some other things that I think Angel will start covering now.
Hi, everyone. So we have three words here: prejudice, discrimination, and racism. A lot of people tend to use these interchangeably, but for the purpose of this presentation, we're going to distinguish between the three of them. As Ellie explained, bias is a cognitive shortcut, and it's not inherently good or bad on its own. Bias is what allows me to say, I don't like this particular apple, so I probably don't like most apples. Unfortunately, that line of thinking just doesn't work when it comes to people because we're all so different. So prejudice is an unjustifiable or irrational bias towards a group of people, as in it's not rooted in facts. Discrimination is when you use that prejudice to define how you're going to treat people, and racism is discrimination with respect to race. So an example of prejudice could be that I think people with glasses are smart. For no reason other than they have glasses, I believe that they are smart. Discrimination would be, I'm going to give these people with glasses apples because I believe that they are smart and they deserve more than the others. Racism would be if I did that with respect to someone's race. So this was something that we found interesting. About a week and a half ago, Merriam-Webster actually changed their dictionary definition of racism. Previously, it only applied to interpersonal racism. So it's the everyday kind of racism where you immediately you see someone and it's that snap judgment that we all make. The new definition includes systemic racism, which is when racism is rooted in the institution. So there's a lot of systemic racism in the US government when we deal with things like police systems, court systems, home ownership, mortgages, and things like that. and Aman will go more into systemic and interpersonal racism.
Thank you, Angel. So when we talk about racism, the academic understanding of racism is in a twofold, with prejudice and systemic power. So we see that racism is a system our country was founded on, and that all our institutions were created out of. And all the institutions reinforce this system, and the system is built on unequal power. So we bring up racial prejudice because anyone could experience racial prejudice. Anyone can feel racial prejudice. That's the discrimination against you because of your skin color. But racism happens when the systemic power is racist towards you. Systemic power has to do with privilege. Systemic power involves groups having access to resources and advantages. And it also gives groups the ability to actualize opinions into cultural and institutional change. So on the next slide, we're going to talk about, we're going to define racism into their certain sectors: internal, interpersonal, cultural, and institutional. So internal is a person's beliefs and actions that serve to perpetuate racism. This could be conscious or unconscious, externalized or internalized, and it basically revolves around your own identity and what you feel. Interpersonal is the most common conception of racism. It's racist interactions between people within and across differences. So this includes microaggressions and racial interactions you have with people. Cultural racism is racism within the values, norms, beliefs, and behavioral patterns in a certain culture. And what we're talking about, which is very prominent in our systems, is institutional racism, which are policies and practices at an organization or sector level that perpetuate racism. So this can be seen from our police force to our government and to capitalism itself, which our country is based upon. So what makes racism so dangerous is not only are they negative feelings towards different races, the system that we live and base our lives around are meant to harm these certain individuals because of their certain race. And although these were the foundations that our systems in America were built upon, we haven't fully gotten rid of those ties, so they still affect us today. Now I'm going to hand it off to my brother and Emma to go into some statistics.
All right, over the next few slides, we're going to go into seeing where in our world today we see these types of racism. Data. Data talks, it helps us visualize the severity, and in this case, helps us visualize the severity of the problem of racism. It helps us not to only persuade, but also to understand the implications of this problem, and it helps us more efficiently determine the causes of these problems and where they are found in our world. Right now, taking the time to learn how to read and interpret different kinds of data is especially important. Data obviously helps us make informed decisions and ultimately identify what parts of a problem need fixing the most and what parts of a problem that are improving the quickest. Knowing where to find credible data is extremely important because so many opinions and actions are formed because of the information that we absorb through this data. For example, in the slide you're seeing right now is a survey that leads to cops stopping different races in New York City over the past 10 years. And the link in the slide will take you to a breakdown of what races were stopped the most. And it goes to show that over half of the innocent people stopped in New York City were Black, followed by Hispanics, and then followed by Caucasians, white people. And it goes to show an important note: population differences change how stats work. Even though, in general, all across the country, more white people are stopped by cops, you have to view it in proportion to the population size. And the data shows that Black people are disproportionately stopped by police in comparison to the other races. This is just one very prevalent example of how racism is spread throughout our community. And go to the next slide. All right, Em.
Can cover this. So basically the idea is that we have to keep everything in proportion. So if we notice that for convictions, we can see that whether it's murder, sexual assault, or drug crimes, Black people are far more likely to be convicted than white people. And there's very little accountability from police. So what we can see is that very, very few police are ever tried or charged with the crime. And this is because of something called qualified immunity, which basically says that police are to charge a police with a crime, you have to show that they are acting outside their line of duty. And the burden falls on you to prove this. And it's very, very difficult to do. So it's very rare that a police is convicted for a crime. And what this ends up causing is that they have a lot of arbitrary power. And this is related to the idea of, this is related to why racism happened, or why racism is appears in the first place. I'll hand back to Arvind to talk about some biases.
Yeah, for sure. So here we have systemic and interpersonal bias, and I'm going to run through some examples. The war on drugs and mass incarceration, redlining in colleges are three major examples of systemic bias against Black people in America. There's a great Netflix documentary called The 13th that explains how the war on drugs started by President Richard Nixon was just a legal mask to help persecute anti-war hippies and African Americans, and it was solely done on racist underlinings, and that was admitted a couple of years ago by one of his aides in the documentary. Redlining was the separation of regions in which mortgage lenders would not give loans to certain people of color just due to their racial identification, and this was prevalent through the mid 1900s. And colleges, as you can see in the graph to your right, it shows percent of people of ages 25 or older who have completed college. And as you'll see is both lines, white and Black people, their trends are trending up. However, this goes to show the extent of the issue, where it's almost as if we have held Black people to a point, well, the system has held back Black people to a point where any kind of aid we do to equalize the playing field will automatically result in progress, but not enough progress because Black people were held back in comparison to their white counterparts. In addition, you'll see in your kind of day-to-day lifestyles wording that is oppressive, wording that is racist inherently. For example, with loans, you'll have articles and news reports saying Black people tend to receive less loans from banks, which makes it seem like it's the Black person's fault, versus banks are less likely to give out loans to Black people. And it's this attention to wording that skews certain opinions, and you have to really keep in mind where you're getting your data from, whether the source is credible, and really make sure you take the time to understand what's really going on. And then we can go to the next slide. So housing problems within the Black community. Is this me or you? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about this.
One more thing I wanted to add about redlining. That in particular has had a huge ripple effect throughout various communities. Because school funding is determined by property taxes, if certain people can't get access to areas with high property taxes, their schools are not funded well. If they don't go to good schools, it's very difficult to get into a good college. If you don't go to a good college, it's hard to get a good job. And from there, you see the cycle repeats because a good family can't afford nice property to send their kids to a good school.
Yep. And if we look at this next graph on the left, we can see that people who tend to buy, or white people who tend to borrow for home mortgages, tend to see an appreciation of the value of the house, versus Black people who do the same actually see a depreciation. And this appears in low, moderate, or high income houses relative to their neighborhoods. If we look at the next graph, we can see that poverty, that the percent of people in poverty is again higher for Black people compared to other races. And this is true in, again, low income households, middle income houses, and high income households. So we can see across the line, and the first graph definitely plays into redlining, because we can see that Black people tend to live in Black neighborhoods, which again have lower incomes. And this is perpetuated by that. So we can see and again, there's the denial rates of home loan applications. Black people are, again, have the highest denial rates, and this has been consistent for many, many years. So consistently, we've seen in the last we've talked about different areas of life in terms of, we've seen in policing, Black people are held back in the, how often they're stopped, how often they're convicted of crimes, how often they go to jail. And they're also held back by the fact that police don't have a lot of the restrictions which Black people or they don't have any restrictions which prevent them from targeting Black people, which causes some interpersonal racism to become systemic racism. So we have to ask ourselves, where are we now? What do we think now? We can see that Black people are affected by a lot of these things. And I know, especially as South Asians, our culture is built around this idea of if we work hard and we do the right thing, that will be successful and be fine. So when we see someone who isn't fine, who goes to jail or doesn't have the success they need, we tend to think that they don't have, or that they either didn't work hard or they didn't, or they did something bad. And to some extent that's true, but a lot of this we see is showing that the effort is not sending us towards economic success, and crime is not relating to convictions or jail time. There are other factors, and the race of someone seems to be one of them, and that's the problem. So Black people and other minorities, we sometimes think that they don't work we might think passively, so we don't actually think about it. We might think that they don't work as hard because they don't get as far in life. But we find that it's almost the opposite, that they do work as hard, and that to get to where we are, they have to fight a lot more obstacles to be able to compete, because there's a lot more obstacles placed in their way. I'll hand it off to Emma for a second.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Going off of what Aradhya was saying, this idea that effort equals success is not true and prevalent in America, as shown in this image. We need to stop shaming other people for putting in less effort and making our children believe that effort equals success. And we need to more gear that idea into effort, put in effort to make our community better so that other people can live a better lifestyle in this country.
Absolutely. And the more we can emphasize this idea of every profession to be respected, and that anyone who's people who may have lower income professions or things which we tend not to think of as successful, maybe working very hard or are working very hard and do deserve this respect. So it's impossible to talk about bias without talking about us, where as South Asians, we are a minority in the United States. But we face a very different story than Black people do. And this is because of the model minority myth. So in the past, we've seen that Asian people were sometimes discriminated against. If you look at the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where they said that too many people are coming from China, and they prevented them from entering the United States. And with Japanese internment camps, where they specifically picked, during World War II, they specifically picked out Japanese to put into internment camps, despite the fact that, again, the war was fought on two fronts, and they didn't specifically pick out Germans to go into internment camps. And we have to keep this idea in account that we're not exempt from racism in that sense. But somewhere in the 1970s and 80s, the United States began to idolize Asian immigrants and Asian communities, because they said that these people work harder, and they removed some of these biases, or they removed a lot of these barriers which Black and Hispanic people have to deal with. But that's a myth. It's not actually true that we necessarily work harder than other races. That almost doesn't make sense. So we are still victims of prejudice, and we've seen, almost all of us have some story which we can say that show that we're hurt by this. And to a certain extent, we do see some systemic racism where we don't find the same success as white people based on our effort, but we're also not put down nearly as much as Hispanic and Black immigrant and Black people. And if we look at the graph on the right, if we look at people who have professional master's or doctorate degrees, we can see that white people are still earning more than Asian communities, but Asian communities also earning much more than Black and Hispanic communities, which shows the level of the obstacles which we're dealing with. I know a lot of us came from, or a lot of my parents at least, and I know a lot of our parents and a lot of the members of OSA came from India and started from scratch, and they've definitely faced a lot of problems as they came and had to start essentially from scratch. But a lot of these obstacles, again, a lot of Black people had to start with this or very low income families, and then also dealt with a lot of these obstacles which the system put on top of them. These lower bank, the lower education, the lower bank loan acceptances, higher higher, they have to be more aware of police. And all of these come together to make it a lot harder for Black people to survive in America. I think it's important to make a distinction here. Why should we care? Because this problem which is going on right now isn't about South Asians or Asians in general. It's about Black people, because we find that these people are put down the most by our system. But first, we're all human, so we should all work for everyone else to have the tools they need to be successful. And I think it's important to point out the difference between equity and equality. And we have a nice graphic in the next slide to show this, but I'll briefly explain. Equality is when we give everyone the same tools. Everyone should have the same experience. So everyone, if we look at college admissions, you can argue that they're equal because everyone can put in an application. But equity goes a step further and says that everyone should have the tools that they need to succeed. If someone has a lower income housing, or if someone has a lower income, then they're put at a disadvantage inherently. So they need to be given extra tools to be able to compete with someone who doesn't have that ability. We're also, from a more specific note, we as South Asians also are a minority. Anything which pushes towards equality, which causes the United States to think of everyone as equal, will help us. And it's really important that we stand with other minorities so that they will stand with us as well as we go forwards. So the more of these barriers we can eliminate, the better we can make the US a place for everyone and not just African Americans as this is going on. I'll ask Emma to explain this.
This graphic nicely illustrates what Aradhya was explaining previously. In this graphic, the tree represents the American justice system or the system in general. Starting with the first box, inequality, which means unequal access to opportunities. You can see that one person has more access to apples than the other. And then the next one, equality, evenly distributed tools and assistance. Both people have the same tools to receive the apples. However, one person has more benefit as the tree/system is leaning more towards that one person. Versus in equity, custom tools that identify and address inequality. One person, they both have ladders, but one person's ladder is adjusted so they have equal access to the apples. And the last one, justice, picking the system to offer equal access to both tools and opportunities. Both people have the same amount of access to the apples and receive the same amount. So they're equal. An important note here is that the difference between equity and justice is that the change comes from, it's a change in the system and not in a change in the tools. So what we should be striving for is justice, which is a change in the system that allows everyone else to access the same opportunities with the same tools. That's what we should be, that's the goal, and that's what we should strive to, and not just stop at equity where it just, where we feel like we're actually giving everyone the same opportunities. But there's always more and better to do. And I think this is a good graphic to illustrate that.
Yeah. So we as the Indian community have to ask, where is our role in this debate, in this fight for equality? And how can we, both as a community within ourselves, how can we start to address racism, and how can we try to get to a place where we become a more welcoming community and we are able to talk about this together? And how can we help bridge the gap into attacking the systemic problems in America which prevent racism? So this is more or less the foundation of everything we've been talking about so far, which how can we talk about what are we fighting for in terms of police accountability and less racism in the country. So at this point, we want to start asking, at this point, the presentation is essentially over. We want to start answering some questions and hopefully move to a discussion.
Yep, so we did get a couple questions and I'll post them all. So we got 3 questions throughout this presentation, and I posted them in the chat, but we can talk about them before we get to our discussion questions that we have lined up. So the first one, aren't Black people disproportionately killed by police because they commit a disproportionate amount of crime? According to the FBI, Blacks commit violent crimes at 7 to 10 times the rate that whites do. So we can talk about this. Does any of the New Jersey guys
Yeah,
have any contributions?
I could take, I could
for it.
try to answer that a little bit. So that information comes from what we were talking about before. It all stems from the war on drugs and mass incarceration. So since those were like legal ways to perpetuate racism, what happened with mass incarceration is that they filled Black communities and communities with people of color with more policing. And so obviously, if you put more police officers somewhere, they'll find a way to charge you. When in reality, white people and people of color commit crimes at the same rate, but there are not as many police officers where the white people are, so not as many people are getting caught. So that data is a little skewed in a sense because just like it assumes that because they're not getting caught, white people aren't committing the crime. So that's where I think, once again, somebody mentioned it, but the book, The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander does a fantastic job explaining the problem with mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness. It talks about all the statistics that argue for why like it's justified, and it really digs deep into the reality of the statistics that we're looking at. So yeah, the FBI may claim that Black people commit crimes at 7 to 10 times the rate, but that's only because they're the ones getting caught, whereas white people are committing the crimes at the same proportion. They're just not getting caught for it, so there's no data to show for that.
I'll also add to this. I know a few specific examples of people who were charged for crimes that they didn't actually commit, and like within the court system, even the evidence is always skewed against them. So there was this one woman named Asata Shakur. She goes by the alias Joanne Chesimard now. She's exiled in Cuba at the moment, I think. This actually happened in New Jersey, on the NJ Turnpike. There was a shootout that happened, and she got shot in her arm. So her arm was paralyzed, and then afterwards, the court still claimed that she killed a cop, even though she was literally paralyzed. She could not move her arm. So she had to escape because she wasn't the one who committed the crime. There's this great book called Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson that goes into a lot of other specific examples of Black people who were incarcerated, put on death row for crimes that they didn't commit, where the evidence was very obvious, like that they weren't the culprit.
Yeah. The other thing to make
Just Mercy is also on Amazon Prime for free this month, so definitely go check it out.
And I think it's free on all platforms for the month of June. So on all platforms, if you search up Just Mercy, it should be free.
It's a great movie.
Yeah. The other thing to keep in mind is even this statistic isn't true, but even if you leave that aside for a second, the number of innocent people is much more than the number of people who have committed crimes. So arguing that you can stop Black people, or you can look for Black people because they on average commit crimes, it just isn't a fair statement. Judging Black people, stereotyping Black people as committing more crimes, even if you would argue that they do commit more crimes, isn't a fair thing to say, because again, that means that people are stopped because of the color of their skin. And we can see that again in the stop and frisk data. Most people who are stopped in the stop and frisk data are totally innocent, but over half of them are Black people anyways. That should raise some concern in and of itself.
So I
Even
can add, sorry.
But maybe
Yeah.
there are some gang related, there are some clusters, places where more Black people might be getting involved, and they're in a situation where maybe they don't have any other choice but to go into a life of crime. That could be a reason for the increase.
Yeah, and if we imagine this in like an Indian analogy, where you can say that I think the 9/11 scare really did it to the Indian community, to the Indian community and all brown people in general. People were being targeted, tires being slashed and even by the government, people were being targeted because of the color of their skin. And it doesn't matter whether even if every other Black person is a criminal, that doesn't mean that a Black person who is innocent should have to face any of that, because it's not like he condones it or anything like that. So it's just not even inherently, even if you argue that Black people commit more crimes, and that by itself is almost certainly not true.
Yeah, and
Um,
it's just a sentence without the assumptions going into it.
Yeah, and it's not, but even if you say that, it's not fair to say that innocent Black people should be stopped or held accountable for any of that. And that is that's most of us, right? That's most of everyone is innocent.
Really quick too, I just also want to mention that we shouldn't, no one, including Black people, should be killed by police in general, regardless of the crime that they commit. We don't really have a death penalty in this country, and no one should have to be killed for a crime that they commit. So even, I think we should also just keep that in mind when we're thinking about this as to where exactly the problems lie.
Right. The police don't kill guilty or innocent people. They're just there to de-escalate.
Yeah.
That should be their job. But
Right.
then,
Yeah. All right. Next question we have is, if capitalism is a racist system, then what is a solution?
I just wanted to go back to that. So the theory of capitalism itself is not racist. It's just its implementation in America is racist because that's what it was built upon. And the theory is, if you work hard and you put in a lot of work, you will become successful based on how much work you put in. That is the general theory of it. So ideally, capitalism is a very fair system. The problem is when people of color, especially Black people and Hispanic people, are put at an unequal setting, they're not able to rise like white people or people with privilege. And what happens is that when the top 1%, when the top 1% don't reallocate those funds back into the system to help those people, that socioeconomic gap continues to grow. So that's what Bernie Sanders was vouching for, a democratic socialist society where we give more emphasis to the government to help these people. That's why taxes are so important, because that tax money and how that tax money is allocated goes to helping those communities. And that giving the government more power is taking away power from the businesses to make those decisions on their own. It puts people at a more disadvantage if they were already at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
Also, I would mention that capitalism is a racist system in this country because Black people and enslaved people were treated as property. So in the history, and this is something that I know Maya has talked about in weeks previously, and just to kind of tie it together, that is still affecting people today, and is a big reason for why capitalism is a racist system. That's not necessarily the solution, but I think at least acknowledging it and recognizing it is an excellent first step.
Yeah, and the second thing is that looking for a full solution to racism is a really strong step, and it's not something which we can easily do. Attacking these facets is definitely a great start, and that's why police accountability is falling so high on the radar in this protest. We can see that the way policing happens and convictions and jail happens is racist right now. So trying to push towards making that equal is a great first step in trying to in mitigating the level of racism. That said, we do need to also attack this core problem of we have an inherently racist society right now, and we need to find ways to tackle that head on. But they're both important. Attacking where things are unequal and trying to make them equal will cause the United States to become more fair, and we should keep working at that while we tackle this inherent problem of racism where we see this happening.
Right. If going back to the question, if you think about capitalism as a system in and of itself, free-flowing capitalism without any restrictions always favors the powerful and who are the people in power in this country. And that's what you have to think about as a system. All right, next question we have is, if Asians are victims of the system, then why do we have the highest median income of any race? What is actually the system which is being talked about?
So the point was that Asians aren't really victims of the system, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be helping people who are. initially in the United States, there was a huge focus on homogeneity. The people who were in charge very much wanted to keep it a white country, which is why we had things like Japanese internment during World War II, but not German internment, even though they were like some of the real villains of the war. And not to say every German, but like Germany was taking the forefront of.
It's yeah. If you want to argue for the fact that we should imprison people of different races because they're from that country, which is a bad idea in and of itself, you would have to argue for both Japanese and Germans, and we just did not do that.
So as times progressed, there was like a rise of Black and Hispanic ability in the U.S. So they were more able to do things. So to suppress them, the government said, "Look at all these amazing Asians we're bringing in," and they just classified them as Asians no matter where they were from. So there was no, we totally missed that amount of nuance in defining who these Asian people are. But even then, the government handpicked the best Asians they could find to say that, hey, look at all these great Asians we brought in. All Asians must be great. And through that, they're suppressing other communities.
Yeah. So saying that
Yeah,
we're
you also. Oh,
Sorry,
you could also talk to. Okay. Also another thing with the Asian model minority myth. When Asian people were brought to this country, they were brought on a different standard than Black people were. So I know, like, when my dad came to this country, and I'm sure like many of our parents came to this country, they weren't starting really off at zero, although they didn't know anyone, or they were new to the culture. They came here with a steady job, and really one of the only reasons they were allowed in this country is because the U.S. government knew that they could work and they could pay taxes and they could help the system. So although not to discredit my dad or any of your parents who had many struggles growing, like being in the country, they came here on a platform because they already had a job. They had some sort of stability coming into this country. Whereas Black people who were racially profiled in this country before, I'll continue. Black people who were racially profiled before, they didn't have that step that Asians had. They started off, like, we might have started off at zero, but they started below zero. There was a statistic found that people from Nigeria who who immigrated to this country on their own, they actually were as successful as Asian Americans in this country. But the problem lies with the Black people whose ancestors came here as slaves, and they had to fight the systems for generations upon generations. They're the ones struggling the most because they never had that step to begin with that we all did.
I also kind of want to mention too that for those exact reasons, Asian people as a group, we do have that can kind of explain why, for example, the highest median income of any race are Asians. But the system as well, I think we had the figure before, is that the system still favors people who are white, and just because we are Asian doesn't mean that we are exempt from going through prejudice. And a recent example, not necessarily to the South Asian community, but to the East Asian community, was with coronavirus outbreak. And I think we all can remember all of the racism that occurred to all of the East Asian people in this country and globally, and in terms of the violence that occurred to them just as they became the face of coronavirus. And in the same way, that's how people of color who aren't Black can still be victims of the system and still be acted against in the system, because those racist tendencies are so embedded.
I was wondering if I could add something about the model minority myth. Sorry to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Something that I really thought is an interesting point that really relates to what you guys are talking about. Great presentation, by the way, that was really helpful. Is that if you look at a lot of the stereotypes that exist in terms of when we look at stereotypes against like Black and Hispanic people and stereotypes that exist with Asian people, is that a lot of the time, when we think of stereotypes towards Asian people, it's like, oh, you're Asian, you must be good at math, or like you must be so like hardworking, or like you must be at the top of your class. Whereas like stereotypes that exist towards other minorities, such as Black and Hispanic people, are like way different in the sense that people call them thugs and people say they're lazy and people say they're violent just by nature. So, I mean, both of those are clearly like racist compliments and neither of them are okay. But in a way, Asian people still benefit from the kind of stereotypes that are placed on us because it still allows people to see us in a more positive light just based on who we are. And, that's not inherently okay either because again, it feeds into this idea that, hey, if Asian people can do it, then so can you, because they also like had nothing when they got here. But like, as you guys were saying, it has a lot to do with the fact that as we've been here, we haven't faced systemic racism. We haven't faced the kind of oppression that Black people have in the sense that, we were granted a job and therefore we could come here, we could choose where we wanted to live, we could and that would affect what kind of schools our kids would go to, and that would affect their futures as well, whereas Black people haven't really had that kind of choice. And it's also something to consider that a lot of Black people who came over here originally did not come here by choice. They were brought here as slaves, and as the generational wealth trickled down, it didn't really help them. Whereas a lot of Asian people chose to come here because they wanted to find better opportunities. So I guess the situations really differ, and that really affects how generations later, even that really affects the dynamics of the wealth that Black people can accrue in this country and the situations that Asians are in.
Yeah.
Yeah, great. So just to bring it back to the question really quickly.
That was awesome.
Yeah,
Thanks
thank
so
you
much. Thanks so much. Yeah, to bring it back to the question really quickly, when we talk about the system, we're primarily talking about, and you can expand the definition if needed, but it's primarily the economy, getting a job, house, having a house and all of that, and the government. How does the government interact with each type? And arguing that they're victims of the system, they were, Asian Americans were definitely victims of the system. Now it's harder to say because of the small minority myth, but we're still being manipulated by the system, if that makes sense. Our reputation is based in racism in the same way that Black people are. It just happens, it's just totally different life which we're presented in.
All right. Moving on to the last question. Can you explain redlining again and how it affects Black households?
I think my sister likes to talk about redlining.
So redlining was a policy that was implemented around the time of desegregation. It was a government policy at first. The intent was really to keep schools segregated as artificially segregate schools. So even though technically segregation was no longer a law, because the school you go to depends on the area you lived in, the government would block off certain neighborhoods and say that these are for Black people, so that the Black people would go to Black schools, and then white people would go to white schools, which is essentially keeping segregation going. Even after the government instituted that policy, though, the way it works is that when you schools are funded by property taxes, so the area you live in determines how much funding your school gets. People who lived in Black neighborhoods typically had very low property values, and low property values means that not a lot of funding goes to the school. Because the school doesn't get a lot of money, Black kids just don't get as good of an education as the white kids did. And from a not very good school, kids would get sent to not very good colleges if they went to college at all. And from a not very good college, it was difficult to get a good job. And the cycle just repeats itself because from a not very good job, you can't make a lot of money with which to buy a better property. So you have these Black people who are stuck in the cycle. Even though redlining is no longer a government policy, people keep getting sent back to the same neighborhoods over and over again because they are unable to make enough money to move out of these neighborhoods.
And it's important to note that, again, because Black people started in this country literally from slavery, where at the beginning, white people had higher incomes than Black people because they had an advantage of their parents making money and their grandparents making money, and it's all the way down. Versus Black people had started with nothing because they literally came straight out of slavery. So that gap causes this income gap at the beginning, and that's what allows this to happen very easily, because higher income neighborhoods would at the beginning primarily be white dominated, versus lower income neighborhoods would be Black dominated because that's where the money was. And because of this system, as my sister explained really well, this continues, and that's why even to this day we can see this gap.
Did that answer your question? I just want to make sure that you understand that now. If you still,
we don't know who asked it.
Yeah,
yeah, it's an anonymous question, but
If I
there,
could-
yeah, someone. I'm gonna post a YouTube link.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I think Angel did a great job explaining it. But if you just want like another refresher, this basically goes over what she just said, in a kind of animated kind of way. So you could watch it later if you guys want.
If I could say one more thing about redlining, just a stat. So obviously, home ownership is a large part of wealth accumulation in America, and this kind of redlining gaps studies show have. I posted the resources to all this data in our PowerPoint, by the way, on the references and resources side. It shows white families have 10 times the net wealth than black families, and also 8 times the net wealth of Hispanic families. And it goes to show there are also studies in certain cities in Georgia where social monetary investment, it's called gentrification, which is the economic investment in places that have been historically discriminated against in cities and towns. So when the government instituted gentrification, or the upgrading or the improvement of economic inequality in these cities, it shifted these red line districts into middle to upper class like cities and towns, which goes to show that social investing or improvements in social work and into infrastructure versus, the issue of funding the police and those the police budgets, a diversion from that is what a lot of the money for this gentrification, for this economic improvement, and it led to these previously redlined districts to become upper and middle class societies where black and white people and Asian all kind of like mesh together and live together.
Thanks. That was our questions that we had that were submitted anonymously. Aradhya, you want to move on to the discussion?
Yeah, sure. And we can talk about this briefly, but I think this is really something which can happen both here, but also at home, and also thinking about it in the future. What are we, like everyone else, have been brought up with certain things in our certain things from our experiences in our past that are continuing today. And I don't think that we're not exempt from being targets of prejudice and racism, and we're also not exempt from being agents of it. So we should go back and ask ourselves, with whatever new knowledge we have about how it goes, what are our beliefs right now about Black people, Hispanic people, ourselves, and white people? What do we believe about them? What do we believe about the system, about the government, and the police, and the economics? And is any of that affected by what we've seen today, or what else we research? Starting to ask these questions in our heads and starting to do more research and getting a better understanding will help us move forward as a community and make sure we have a more informed opinion. So a couple questions which I was hoping to talk about in breakout session. I'm not sure if that's.
Yeah, I don't think we can do breakout sessions for this one.
Yeah, no problem.
So we'll just do it as a whole. So we came up with a few discussion questions. What can we do to combat racism and anti-Blackness or prejudice against Black people in our everyday lives? What are the different ways that we've benefited from demands of racial equality, which we talked about throughout a lot of this presentation? How can we reduce our own prejudices, and how can we talk to others about this?
And I think this last one is really important. I know that everyone here is, everyone who joined here is at the very least open to change and open to thinking about these ideas. And I'm really grateful for everyone who came. But it's also important for us to talk about to people who aren't necessarily as open to change, or have these ideas, have some values which they've grown up with, which they haven't thought about as much, and don't necessarily feel the need to think about it right now. So a question is, how can we make them feel that need, and how can we start changing minds and growing this into a larger, and growing the number of people we have behind our ideas.
So any thoughts, any questions, anything?
I actually just wanted to say one quick thing about the last part, which is how can we talk to others about this? I really want to encourage everyone here. I'm sure we all know people that don't necessarily agree with everything that we talked about. Like Aradhya said, we're all very grateful for everyone joining today, but I think it makes a big difference to just invite and encourage people we know that won't necessarily choose to come to conversations like these, and bring them to conversations like these so that they can also discuss everything in a space where they can ask the questions that they have and address the concerns that they have. Because otherwise we do end up in an echo chamber of sorts where we end up just talking to everybody who agrees with us, and there isn't really much progress being done to kind of change the viewpoints of people around us. So and from my point of view, I think that's a good way that we can start to talk to others about this.
Yeah, Ellie brings up a good point. Like I see 33 people here today, which, you know, might be because of Father's Day. But maybe you know people who, maybe you know other Ordia people who are not as open to whoever. Everyone on this chat is very open to discussing changes, but maybe you know someone that's not. Maybe you can invite them to next week's call. So just starting out by little things like that.
Yeah, and not limited to just Ordia people. Like anybody is welcome and encouraged to join these sorts of discussions with everyone. Yeah.
And definitely emphasizing on what they had said at the beginning, that have those uncomfortable conversations, like start that conversation and see where that goes. I've had some discussions about these issues that have happened with people who say they are not racist, but unintentionally do make racist comments where they may not think they're racist, but underneath it all, they have been trained, they have been raised in a way that gives them racist tendencies. So definitely have those conversations, open up the floor to uncomfortable discussions, and pave the way for that change in their minds. You can change one person's mind and still be successful in your agenda for that day.
Yeah, and I think it's important to know that we definitely don't want to put down anyone who has these tendencies, because it's we're human. We have to grow up based on experiences and what we've learned, and we have to continue following that. So in no way is this supposed to be telling people that they're wrong or that they should fix themselves. But we want people to start thinking about this, and if we have these experiences we're brought up with, which aren't representative of what's happening now or what the world is like today, we should do our best to try to update these so that we don't hurt people who don't deserve it. So the more we can emphasize this idea of, we know that it's okay to be where we are, but we want to get better, and have a more informed viewpoint, we can start to really.
That kind of relates to one of the slides in the beginning about bias, and how bias are these cognitive shortcuts that we don't really think about. So like Ananya said, people in our lives who don't think that they're racist, but do have racist tendencies underneath, it's due to these biases that we get, not even realizing that it's happening, and it's due to the information that we intake from our world. So it's kind of up to us to educate and kind of broaden what we're reading and what we're looking at to rewire that essentially, and complete the information that we're getting in.
Yeah, I would say on top of this, to not be racist, it's just as important to be anti-racist. So when we hear things with undermining racist messages, we need to call that out and have those conversations and explain why that's not right.
Mm-hmm.
All right, on that note, I think let's open it up to others, whoever has anything to say, any thoughts. I know right now, definitely in Georgia, where I'm from, we have had a spark in this conversation because of what had happened to Rayshard Brooks and everything that has surrounded that situation right now. So if you have anything on your mind that you'd like to discuss with everyone, please, now's the time to do so.
I see a question, or I see comments from Sonaria Singh that they tried to get them to talk to their 7-year-old about racism, which is fantastic. We were actually, one of our future talks was going to be about prejudice, and we were going to separate that conversation by age group. So whenever you see that talk in the future, definitely bring your 7-year-olds, your 5-year-olds, because we do have talks geared towards the younger generation and how to bring up that question with them.
I also just put 2 links into the chat, which is kind of geared towards how to explain racism to younger kids. And one is a link tree, so that leads to other links with other books and other videos. And then the first link is just a book, it's just a list of books that kind of touch on it as well. So those are just some before we kind of get to the eventual conversation where we talk about how to talk about racism with younger kids. And I think like, Emma was also.
I believe Kevin Hart has a Netflix special with his daughter on Black history and slavery and just like the injustices for Black people in America. I'm not entirely sure, so I have to double check on that. But yeah, that is definitely something to look into if you want to watch something.
Yeah, it's on Netflix. It's pretty good.
Yeah.
And then we are in the process of gathering materials and dividing them by age group and by media. So that's coming out for everyone too. Any other questions or discussion points?
I had a question about gentrification.
Yeah.
Wouldn't that like, couldn't gentrification like cause more division because it pushes out people from neighborhoods because they have like higher rents now and it's not as affordable?
Yeah, so you see that in like San Francisco, right, where there are people that are literally being pushed out because there are, well, often white people or really privileged people of color that are moving in, and these people, once they get pushed out, they don't really have anywhere to go, because while these areas are being revitalized, there aren't any other areas that are being revitalized for these people to move into. So yeah, it absolutely causes dissension. And I think that as South Asians, we do benefit from this somewhat, especially those in Silicon Valley and those who are who have more money. I did want to make a point about the model minority myth, which was something that was brought up. I think that oftentimes we group all Asian Americans into one group. It's important to note that they aren't a monolithic group, that there are in fact Asian Americans that are underperforming, that are underrepresented, and this may be due to colorism. So you see fair-skinned East Asians doing better in general in society. I think that has to do with their proximity to whiteness because they are lighter skinned. You also see darker skinned Asian Americans, for example, Cambodians, Thai people, Indonesian people, Filipino people, etc., who are often not given the same opportunities. And the same way that the model minority myth is beneficial, it can also be used as a cudgel to say, like, how come these people aren't doing as well when, their East Asian counterparts are doing so well? So it's kind of like a double-edged sword in that way. And I also think that it can be used to sort of push Asian Americans as a group towards certain fields where they seem to be doing, where they seem to be overrepresented, quote unquote, instead of, and sort of push them into those boxes and pigeonhole them into pursuing those fields. So while it is beneficial in some ways, I think it's also important to note that it can actually be very detrimental.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And another really big problem with this is that because as a nation we put these people in these boxes, we don't have finding a lot of data or specific data the same way we can find data of Asian Americans versus Black people versus white people. It's very hard to find similar data for a lot of these smaller subdivisions. And this also causes problems because we can't even see a lot of the discrimination that's happening in terms of smaller subdivisions. But really good point for bringing that up.
I wanted to bring a point about the crime stats that was brought before, that Black people commit more crime. This morning I read an article in the Washington Post where someone wrote of all the crimes she committed but was not charged because she was white, while she saw her Black friends being arrested for the same crimes. A police officer might go and say, all right, you're a young kid, I'll leave you alone. But if he's a young Black kid, he might be arrested. And what happens is, even violent crime, I'm coming from a science perspective, if a teenager is being sent to jail, what does that do for their mindset from psychological perspective? I don't know how many people know about epigenetics, but our life experiences changes who we are. It's not just genes, it's also experiences. And if a young child sees his father being sent to jail, and the young kid is being sent to jail, and it does affect them, and the society, when they put them through a lifetime of poverty, doesn't matter if it's United States or India, there's more crime in poor neighborhoods than rich neighborhoods. And we have to ask why. Why are people so desperate that crime is more prevalent in those types of places? And so, for example, marijuana use is equally across all races, but it's Black people who are being targeted for that. And for three marijuana cases, is lifetime imprisonment, just like California, the three-strike laws. And that just perpetuates this generation after generation, year after year. And that can also skew the statistics. It's not because Black people have a special crime genes, they don't. We all have the same genes, but it's how we're affected over lifetime that might skew the statistics of why there are more violent crime in Black neighborhoods.
That is so
Also, oh, sorry.
No, go ahead.
Also, these conversations about crime really bring up some really disturbing situations, such as the prison industrial complex. If you've seen 13th, you probably know what I'm talking about. This documentary talks about it a lot, which is that the problem with we have like the 13th Amendment that freed slaves, supposedly like freed slaves a long time ago. But there's a loophole in the 13th Amendment which essentially allows people who are in prison to be used as slaves, in the sense that you may or may not be familiar with the concept of prison labor, but a lot of companies and big corporations in this country profit off of using labor done by people who are in prison. So when we're seeing that Black people are more likely to be convicted or incarcerated at higher rates, what you're basically seeing is that it's like a legalized form of slavery that still exists in this country. And it has a lot of obviously detrimental effects upon the community and upon Black people in general. And another problem with the situation of Black people being convicted and incarcerated at higher rates is that, unfortunately, in this country, regardless of the crime that you've been convicted for, once you become a convicted felon, you lose a lot of rights. There are some people who have been given things such as life charges for petty drug crimes, and that permanently strips them of their right to vote. So, what we're seeing here is that the problem with Black people being incarcerated unfairly at higher rates is that it is allowing them to be subject to a lot of situations that were supposedly illegal in other circumstances, such as voter suppression and slavery. And I think that it really brings up some conversations about how we really need to rewire the way we think about the prison system and the way we think about jails and police and about why they exist. Because right now, the way that they're being used is allowing some really terrible things to happen to people. And, people who don't really know about it can think of it as, they're criminals. They should just be in jail and they don't deserve to complain about these sorts of things. So I think we really need to make sure that we educate more people about how those systems work so that people are more sensitive towards those kinds of people.
100%. Thank you, Shreya, for that. One thing I want to add to that is when we think about why it is, also, hi, I'm to everyone, if you haven't met me before, I'm Maya. To everyone to think about why it is that police go out of their way to criminalize people and send them to jail. Part of the ways that police bring in revenue for cities and for private industrialists and whoever is through sending people to the prison populations, because large prison populations means more people to, do unpaid labor. More people who are in prison are charged for being in prison too. They and their families have to pay that. So the reason that police are criminalizing people and trying to get their incarceration rates up is not for any semblance of safety, but in order to create profit in that way. And if you look into a lot of things that police, like reports that police provide to city councils to argue that their budget should be increased, a lot of it is them convincing city councils, hey, if you increase our budget, we'll increase revenue by incarcerating more people so that they have to pay more fines, giving more parking tickets or whatever it might be. So kind of adding that relationship between police, property, people, and prisons can help us think about that too.
Which goes back to the question that we talked about, the question that was submitted well, the FBI says Blacks commit more violent crimes than whites do. You have to look at where the data is coming from and why that data is.
And we have a lot of private prisons, and they do need criminals to stay in business. So we have to question, why should we have private prisons in a democratic country?
And public prisons work just the same way. They're just making money for the government instead of private folks.
Do we have any other questions? Or points of discussion?
Okay, this is Utkal. So coming back to this systemic discrimination, one point that comes to my mind is that definition of what is called crime. A guy trying to use a fake $20 bill gets killed versus take the case of the financial crisis. There are billions of money lost, but how many were even criminal charged, right? So I think when we are talking about reforms and things like that, we have to also think in our representatives, political representatives, what kind of bills they are bringing, right? Those billions lost are probably, there should be definitely more folks behind the bar who caused that crisis, but none of them were, which means that the current laws and things like that are holding up to these petty crimes, like, you are trying to do some pickpocketing, trying to scare somebody off the street. Those are considered as severe crimes compared to these big crises, right? So the accountability part, all those things are probably something that we need to push on when we are looking for our representatives around the local area, right? That was one of the comments I have.
I 100% agree with that. I think a lot of these smaller crimes are being fought back with much more brutal force. First of all, no one, like regardless of what they've done, should be killed for a crime committed. They should be detained and they should go through the process, whatever the proper justice system. But for example, I know I brought up Rayshard Brooks earlier today, that the police were called because he was supposedly driving under the influence, and he was asleep in his car after having been drunk for a while, and he began, obviously not in his right mind, he went for the policeman's taser and started running, and the man shot him in his back multiple times, and he died from that. But first of all, like a DUI, so many people have gotten off, and he even offered, let me just walk home now. Like, I will go home, I will walk home now, to avoid any conflict. And they were determined to detain him. And in that moment, that's definitely not the way you confront a DUI case. Let him run away, run the license plate numbers, you know who he is, go arrest him later. That is not the type of force that should be brought upon someone who has just been faced with a DUI. While he wasn't even really driving when they got him, he was asleep in his car in a parking lot. So things like that, it's definitely, they focus more on who they can detain and how they can get money from that and how they can get revenue from it, rather than what the actual crime was and what has been committed.
I just have just want to follow up on what you said. You made like really good points, but I've had like this conversation with a lot of my friends, and they're saying like police have certain protocol for certain DUIs, and Rayshard Brooks actually had a warrant for his arrest on him, which is why he kind of wanted to go home, because police were already looking to arrest him. So a lot of people are trying to justify the police using his weapon, like because Rayshard Brooks took the taser and tried to harm the police officer, but at the end of the day, regardless of what Rayshard Brooks was doing, the job of a police officer is to de-escalate the situation. So even if the police officer had to use force on Rayshard Brooks, the whole problem is that he shot and killed Rayshard Brooks, and that was not okay. And it's like, you could say like if it was a white person that was in the same situation as Rayshard Brooks, maybe the police officer would have taken a different approach. And that could be made the case in many different situations. And the bottom line that we talk about why we need police reform and we need to increase police training is because killing someone should never be that first option. Even if you're to bring your gun out, you should be aiming at the legs or the ground. You should, or like you said, let him run away and run the license plate number to find him. And you said like, there's so many other options you could have taken. We don't, like Alipa was saying earlier, like we don't have a death penalty in this, like in most states in this country, because no one in the system believes that it's our right to take someone's life away. So just because you're a cop in position of power, you don't have the right to take someone's life. The job of a cop, I've seen a lot of people, family members, friends who are scared for their relatives and friends who are cops because they put their lives on the line. Like, yeah, it's a scary job, but you have to realize that is the whole point of being a cop. It's to risk your life to protect other people. It's putting your life in front of other people. And that's why the ideal cop is so well praised, because they're heroes in our eyes. But unfortunately, there are too many cops out there that aren't policing the way they should. They aren't protecting us. They'd rather save their own lives than protect the other citizens. And that's fine as a normal person, but you have to understand being a police officer is so difficult because you have to put other people's lives in front of yours. And that's why not everyone that's a cop right now should be a cop, because not every cop can do that. So that's when we talk about police reform, police training, going through different like more strenuous like programs to become a cop. We're doing this because we cannot have the quote unquote bad apples in a job that can very easily end someone's life.
Yeah, I have a little different perspective on that, and I think this is something we've talked about a little bit in the last couple of weeks. But kind of when we were talking about the prison industrial complex, it actually is the job, like what a cop's job boils down to is protecting property over people. So that is actually why we see this as not being a problem of a few bad apples, but a systemic thing that all over the country, there's all these different, like, why is it that it's not just in a few places, but it's all over the country? And it's not just recently, it's for, years and years and years. Why is it that cops continuously are able to put their own jobs, their own fears and property over people's lives? And the reason is because that does not actually go against what it means to be a cop. Which harkens back to what we were talking about in the first week about how in the US, the two kind of origin stories of cops in the southern states comes from folks who were tasked with going to find Black folks who had escaped their enslavers. And then in the North, in Boston, originated from like private industrialists who created these police patrols in order to protect property, like protect their factories and their storefronts, as well as quell worker rebellions. So like if workers are trying to unionize, the cops would bust those up. So actually, from my perspective, and also there's data that shows that things like increasing training, all that actually does is that puts more money into the policing system. It doesn't actually reduce the rate of crimes. What a lot of these training programs do is, things like, it's not like, oh, don't kill people. It's do these 3 steps before you kill someone. And they don't, for example, a lot of the reforms that people are pushing right now, including increased training and racial sensitive training, a lot of the cops in Minneapolis as a city had already instated those reforms. And yet we're still seeing, what happened with George Floyd, similarly with Atlanta. So from my perspective, I think actually what we need to be doing is reducing our reliance on policing as the safety system. And we're not going to do that by throwing more money at police. I was at an event yesterday that I want to share a reflection from, because it was an event put on by this really incredible activist group called the Hood Squad in East Palo Alto, which is a city near where I live. I live in Silicon Valley, which has been, decimated by the tech industry. And East Palo Alto is a city with like a lot of Black and brown people that has just been at the forefront of like basically big tech has just decimated that city. And they threw this really great Juneteenth celebration yesterday that was open to all. It was like led by Black folks. There was entertainment, food. And for one example of how safe and amazing the space was, there's this woman, this houseless woman who comes to a lot of this activist group's events. She's a houseless Black woman in the community, and she like harasses people a lot. Like when people are performing, she'll go up on stage and like get in their way. When like rappers are doing their thing, she'll go and try to grab the mic from them. And the community just comes together and like they're like, hey, you like, they just like keep her out of the way, work together. There's no need to call the cops on her, right? They give her time on the mic later. And the reason I'm sharing this reflection is because at the end of the event, the organizers like turned to those of us who weren't from East Palo Alto and said, like, we need you to go back to your communities and tell them how safe you felt in this Black-led space where safety was not provided by the police, but by our community. And so that's something I want to reflect back. Like, why don't we, instead of saying, let's throw more money at the police and hope they get better because of it, when we know that, when we've seen that that hasn't happened, what if we stopped relying on them when we have safety concerns that are things like a homeless person that is maybe harassing people and we don't know what to do, or someone sleeping in a car and we're concerned that they maybe were drinking and now they're going to drive. What if we had other ways that there were the communities who live around those people? There's a person I can call and I know that they have dealt with drunk drivers before and they don't have a gun and they're going to go talk to this person and figure out what needs to happen and give them a ride home, or take their keys away if they're not cooperating. Because that's really all that needs to happen with a drunk person who you think is going to drive. Just take their keys away, right? So yeah, I just wanted to reflect that back because for me, the spaces I felt the safest in are where I know that there are community members around who care about the safety of everyone in the space. And so I would like to see us move towards that instead of continuing to rely on police for those things.
So I totally agree with what Maya said. There are actually 2 SCOTUS cases where they said that the police have no duty to protect you from harm. And also, I think that a lot of people have a very hard time conceptualizing a reality in which there aren't police around all the time. I think that it's already there. Like if you look at suburbs, there aren't necessarily police people patrolling all the time looking to bust people, so it's definitely possible. I think that you're right. We shouldn't be throwing more money towards police officers. We should actually be reinvesting into social workers and other people who are skilled in tackling social issues. Because what happens is we've relied for far too long on police officers to fix every single ill that's been created in our society. Like if there's a mentally ill person, what do? You call the cops. If there is a drunk person, what do? You call the cops. Like literally every single issue that has cropped up, the only thing we have to deal with it is calling the cops. And I think that puts undue pressure on them, and it also doesn't help fix the root cause of these issues. So yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also important to note that like police training is like hundreds of hours of like combat style training and like 9 hours of learning how to de-escalate things. So I don't know about you, but I think that ratio is really off. So yeah.
I'm a high school student, so I wanted to add something that relates to schools and what I've seen on my campus. I have seen 2 police officers on my campus, and I see them almost every single time I'm outside of a building, but we have 1 social worker on campus and I like never see her. And I think that's just kind of weird that even in a school, they feel the need to police us more than provide us support. And it's really weird because I have talked to people on my campus who have said, I have no idea, like I have anxiety or I have family issues and I have no idea where to find the social worker, or I have no idea, where to get some help. But, anytime, somebody's walking outside, they can see 1 or 2 officers around on campus. And it also makes the students feel uncomfortable because, we've seen situations where, for example, people with disabilities or people with mental illnesses sometimes may act in ways that somebody who is not trained to deal with them may not know how to deal with. And we're seeing that people who have disabilities or mental illnesses are also killed or hurt at higher rates by police officers because they're trained to use authority and force. They're not necessarily trained to learn how to deal with situations in nonviolent ways. And you can tell because of the way they are armed and, you know, they're given tasers, they have guns, they have way more training how to use those than, you know, actually talk to and interact with people who may have disabilities or illnesses and may have communication issues, or who may feel unsafe around police officers because they are armed. So what we're seeing is that, you know, obviously the fears that people have around like lowering funding towards the police are to a certain extent valid because of the way those people believe that the police exists to quote unquote protect and serve. But what we really see is that the police mostly just are interested or are trained to use force. So, you know, I think it would really be more beneficial if we start seeing switching over to having trained mental health workers and social workers and all these other people as first responders, right, and having police as last responders. What we would see is that a lot of people who, you know, are killed or are hurt by police for situations or circumstances that they can't really control about themselves, like their skin color or a mental illness or a disability, then what we would be seeing is that, you know, this like murder rate that we have, you know, in 2019, the police killed more than 1,000 people, and that's absolutely unacceptable because in other countries, for example, Japan's police like murder rate is like 2 for 2019. So, you know, I think we really need to think about the way we address what is the role of police in our country, and, you know, should we be shifting those roles to people who are more adequately trained to deal with them?
And I 100% agree about the school police patrolling the school. That's definitely something that has been on my mind even before all of these situations occurred. I am super friendly with well, I just graduated from high school, but when I was there, I was super friendly with the police officer who would patrol our school. And I knew him and I knew he's a nice guy, but every single time I saw him, my heart would sink. I would catch my breath because I knew he had a gun and I was terrified of that. The fact that there is a gun on campus, regardless of who it's on, is not something that should be there. Like, it should not be there. It should not be on a safe, it's supposed to be a safe campus, and I did not feel safe when I knew there was a gun on campus.
Right. To add to that, in my public high school, we're understaffed in mental health, just services and people to reach out to, versus in every hallway, there's at least one armed police officer there. I personally don't feel like that's a safe environment, and I really think there needs to be change in that. I think that's really important.
Yeah, and that was my cultural shock when I came here. I didn't see a police officer in India in school. Here in my high school, NYPD, dozens of NYPD officers roaming in high schools. And then they'll be arresting 15, 16-year-old students for being teenagers. And that goes back to starting the cycle of incarceration, putting them in jail at such a young age. Why should we have police for 14, 15, 16-year-old kids? That was a cultural shock for me.
And something, Sona, you had brought up earlier about how Black teens are more like, they are arrested at a far higher rate. Especially being here, what I see is if you're a Black teen and you're hanging out with your white friends, they can do a lot of things that you have to double, triple check, and you have to say that, no, I can't do it, because you know there's a chance that you will be called out, you will be targeted for that. But they can very easily get away with it, and that causes a lot of like confusion for teens as well. Like, why is it that I did the exact same thing as my friend here and I was the one who got in trouble for it, type of thing. And that's just a baseline example of how racism and how everything regarding like police's reaction, the systemic racism within police itself, and how that affects teenagers and how that affects their mindset. And because in the future they will be more inclined to committing crimes or doing whatever they can just to get by, because like they're already put at a disadvantage.
Yep. That brings me back something funny. I was talking to my friend who supported the violence and looting, especially attacking police officers, a couple of weeks back. And she was white. But I was like, you are supporting randomly attacking police officers. You're supporting this violence, but whom do you think will pay the price? You won't pay the price, or white people will not pay the price. It's the Black kids who will be arrested. So, and that, first of all, I'm against violence, but when you're if you're being an ally, think about why are you being an ally. If you're going to destroy things, you will go scot-free and your black friend will be arrested.
That is so true. And especially just one thing that I had noticed was there are a lot of videos circulating on the web where it's not Black people who are doing the looting, and there are some, but for the most part it is not them. It is any other like people of color, any white people, everyone else who are doing this thing in anger because I'm sure Black people would want me to. That's not the case. I've seen a video of a Black woman telling them to stop. Like, that's not what we want, because that's defeating the purpose of these protests. It's supposed to be peaceful because that's the only way for our point to come across without us being seen as thugs and people who do not deserve that time to speak.
Thanks, Ananya. I think we're gonna try to wrap up soon, since we're at an hour and a half. Next week, I do want to talk about watching the 13th for a discussion about it, which was perfect because everyone mentioned it this week. So perfect segue to that. So we do want to discuss that movie next week. So please watch it if you can. And if you want us to bring up a specific topic, if we want to go into detail about a specific topic, please use that form and let us know, and then we can try to address it in the future.
I just have one thing that I wanted to add before.
Yeah, go ahead.
In conjunction to what Ananya said, and I know this has been brought up before, that we need to be listening to the Black voices around us and what they're asking from us, because none of us, I mean, like, I personally am not Black, so I can't make a judgment about what is needed and what like is the right thing to do. I need to be looking and reading and educating myself about what to do, and that's what all of us are trying to do. None of us are perfect, and just educating ourselves and seeing like, okay, what are people asking of me? Like, what is actually needed from me in terms of how can I actually be a better person in this movement, is kind of what we should be focusing on. So I think that's just a good thing to be doing moving forward.
Reddy, this is Nagesh. Also, I think a lot of good questions, a lot of good material. As we get our material ready, let's start pushing those out, because all the people who haven't seen or attended today, we can share the YouTube link, as well as share a page on a website to show that these were the questions that were asked, and here are some reading material, here is some responses that for you to read, and so on. So the people who are here, let's take the responsibility of trying to spread the message, at least to a few other people in our community, and go from there.
Just going off of what Nagesh uncle just said, it'd be really helpful if everyone in this chat can try to get like one person or one family that hasn't been a part of these Zoom calls, and just get them to join next week. Because if everyone in this chat gets one different family, we now have a much bigger group. And it's always great to have allies on our side and to like inform them of these kind of that might not be like as much of an ally as we are, so we could inform them and spread as much information as we can to the people we need to spread the information to.
All right. And if anyone knows anyone that wants to present, please let us know too. I put my email and Maya's email in the chat. So whatever questions, comments, anything you want to address, please let us know.
So Utkal and I are trying to reach out to other chapters to see if there are youth who are working in those states who would like to come and join here. We'll see what we can. But again, let's do reach outs in whatever, right? Apart from, as Aman mentioned, right, apart from one family that we know, let's see if we can find one family in a different state from where we are living, and pull them in and see if we can make that happen. Slowly we can increase the community here.
Yeah.
Cool. See everyone.
Absolutely. I think
Thank you, everyone.
Yeah.
Thanks for the hard work and nice presentation. Very educational.
Bye.